The wild Mustang stood at the canyon's edge with nostrils flaring and eyes rolling white with terror. And Willow Nash knew she had perhaps 3 minutes before the stallion would either charge past her or throw himself over the cliff rather than be captured by the men with their ropes and their rough hands. She stepped forward slowly, her boots making small crunching sounds on the gravel, and began to hum a melody her grandmother had taught her years ago, when she was just a girl learning the old ways that most folks had forgotten or dismissed as nonsense. The year was 1883, and the Texas plains stretched endlessly in every direction from Abilene, a town that had grown from a rough cattle shipping point into something resembling civilization, though the wildness still lingered in the hills and canyons where creatures like this magnificent black stallion roamed free. Willow had been tracking this particular horse for 3 days, ever since old Mr. Patterson had hired her to gentle his newest acquisition, a Mustang he had purchased sight unseen from a trader passing through who claimed the horse was unbreakable. Most people thought Patterson was a fool for hiring a woman barely 23 years old to do work that seasoned horsebreakers twice her age could not manage. But Patterson had seen Willow work before, had watched her turn a vicious mare into a riding horse so docile his granddaughter could handle her. The stallion's ears flicked forward as Willow's humming continued, a low sound that seemed to vibrate through the air itself, and she took another step closer, her hands held low and open, showing she carried no rope, no whip, nothing that would cause him pain. The morning sun had just begun to rise over the canyon rim, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and in that light Willow's dark hair seemed to catch fire where it fell loose from the braid she had woven before dawn. She wore men's trousers because skirts were impractical for this kind of work, and a simple cotton shirt that her mother had made for her before the fever took her 2 winters past. From somewhere behind her, hidden among the rocks where she had insisted they wait, the men Patterson had sent to assist were watching with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Willow had learned to ignore the stares, the whispers, the way men looked at her like she was something strange and unknowable. Her gift had always set her apart, this ability to understand horses in a way that seemed almost supernatural to those who did not share it. Her grandmother had possessed it too, had passed down not just the humming technique, but an entire philosophy about how to approach these wild creatures with respect rather than dominance. The stallion took a step toward her, then another, his great head lowering slightly as if he were trying to understand what manner of human would approach him without aggression. Willow continued her humming and began to whisper words in a language that was part English and part something older, something that had no proper name but seemed to resonate with the horse's own wild spirit. She told him about green pastures and cool water, about safety and gentleness, about a life where he would still run free, but would no longer fear the crack of thunder or the sting of cruel hands. The moment stretched between them like something tangible, and then the stallion took 3 more steps forward and lowered his muzzle until it was close enough for Willow to feel his hot breath on her outstretched fingers. She remained perfectly still, continuing her whispers, and when the stallion finally allowed her to touch his velvet nose, she heard one of the men behind her let out a low whistle of amazement. "I'll be damned," a voice said, and Willow recognized it as belonging to Jake Morrison, one of Patterson's ranch hands who had been particularly vocal about his doubts regarding her abilities. "She's actually doing it." Willow did not respond or even turn to acknowledge the comment. All her attention remained focused on the stallion, on building this fragile bridge of trust between them. She stroked his nose gently, still whispering, still humming in intervals, and gradually began to move her hand up to his cheek, his forehead, behind his ears where horses love to be scratched. The stallion's eyes, which had been showing white with fear, began to soften, and his body relaxed incrementally as he realized this human meant him no harm. It took another 20 minutes before Willow felt confident enough to begin leading the stallion away from the canyon edge, and even then she moved with careful deliberation, never pulling on him, never forcing him, simply walking and trusting that he would follow. And he did, step by careful step, until they had moved far enough from the cliff that the immediate danger had passed. Only then did Willow allow herself to breathe a full breath and feel the tension that had been coiled in her shoulders begin to release. The men emerged from their hiding places among the rocks, and that was when Willow saw him for the first time. He was not one of Patterson's regular hands, but someone new, tall and lean with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore a battered hat pushed back on his head and a red bandana around his neck, and there was something in the way he moved that suggested both strength and a kind of careful grace that Willow associated with men who had spent their lives working with animals rather than against them. "Miss Nash," Jake Morrison called out, his earlier skepticism replaced with grudging admiration. "That was the damnedest thing I've ever seen." "How'd you learn to do that?" Willow kept one hand on the stallion's neck, maintaining the connection they had established. "My grandmother taught me," she said simply. "She believed horses understand more than we give them credit for. You just have to know how to speak their language." The newcomer had not spoken yet, but Willow could feel his gaze on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. When he finally did speak, his voice was low and rough, like gravel sliding over leather. "I've been working with horses my whole life," he said, "and I've never seen anything like you." Willow turned to look at him fully then and felt something shift in her chest when their eyes met. There was no mockery in his expression, no dismissiveness or condescension. Instead, she saw genuine wonder and a kind of recognition, as if he understood on some fundamental level what she had just accomplished and respected it in a way that went beyond mere admiration of a clever trick. "Marcus Whitmore," he introduced himself, taking off his hat in a gesture that seemed old-fashioned even by 1883 standards. "Mr. Patterson hired me on last week to help with the horse operation. He said he had someone special coming to work with the Mustang, but he didn't mention." He trailed off, as if unsure how to finish the sentence. "Didn't mention it would be a woman," Willow supplied, a hint of challenge in her voice. Marcus shook his head slowly. "Didn't mention she'd be able to do something I've spent 15 years trying to learn and never quite managed." He stepped closer, his movements calm and measured, and the stallion barely flicked an ear in his direction. "Would you teach me? What you do, I mean, if it can be taught?" The question surprised Willow. Most men were content to marvel at her skill, without wanting to understand the work and patience behind it. They preferred to think of it as some kind of magic, something mysterious and feminine that they could admire from a distance without having to challenge their own methods or beliefs. But Marcus seemed different. He watched her the way she watched horses, with attention and curiosity and a willingness to learn. "It can be taught," Willow said carefully, "but it requires patience, and you have to be willing to unlearn most of what you think you know about breaking horses." Marcus smiled then, and it transformed his entire face, softening the hard planes and making him look younger than she had first estimated. He could not have been much older than 26 or 27, she thought, young enough that his methods might not yet be so set in stone that he could not adapt them. "I reckon I can manage that," he said. "Patience is one thing I've got in abundance." Jake Morrison interrupted before Willow could respond. "We should get this horse back to Patterson's ranch before he decides to bolt again. Miss Nash, you need help leading him." Willow shook her head. He'll follow me now, but someone should ride ahead and make sure the corral is prepared. He'll need a space that's quiet and secure, away from the other horses until he's had time to settle. Marcus volunteered immediately. I'll do it. I know which corral will work best. He swung up onto his own horse, a sturdy paint gelding that stood calmly despite the presence of the wild stallion, and touched his hat brim in Willow's direction, before riding off toward Patterson's ranch at an easy canter. The walk back took most of the morning, with Willow leading the stallion on foot and speaking to him in quiet tones whenever he showed signs of nervousness. The other men rode at a distance, understanding without being told that crowding the Mustang would undo all the progress Willow had made. The Texas sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the air hot and dry, and by the time they reached Patterson's spread, Willow's shirt was sticking to her back with sweat, and her throat was parched with thirst. Marcus had prepared everything exactly as she had requested. The corral was set apart from the main barn, shaded by a grove of cottonwood trees, with fresh water in the trough and hay scattered in one corner. Willow led the stallion through the gate and released him, stepping back quickly to give him space to explore his new surroundings. The horse trotted the perimeter of the fence, testing it with his nose and hooves, but he did not try to jump or break through. After a few minutes, he approached the water trough and drank deeply, a sign that he was beginning to relax and accept his situation. "That'll do for now," Willow said, exiting the corral and latching the gate behind her. "He needs time alone to adjust. Tomorrow I'll start working with him again." Mr. Patterson himself had come out to watch the final stages of the stallion's arrival, and he nodded approvingly at Willow's words. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a white beard and sharp blue eyes that missed very little. "Fine work, Miss Nash, as always. You'll stay in the guest quarters, same as before." Willow had stayed at Patterson's ranch several times over the past 2 years, whenever he had a horse that needed her particular skills. The guest quarters were actually a small cabin set away from the main house, simple but clean, with a bed and a stove and a window that looked out over the hills. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Patterson. I expect it will take about 2 weeks to have him ready for basic handling." "Take whatever time you need," Patterson said generously. "A horse like that is worth the investment. Marcus here will be at your disposal if you need an extra pair of hands. He's got a good way with horses himself, better than most of the men I've hired over the years." Marcus, who had been leaning against the corral fence watching the stallion, straightened and nodded. "Happy to help however I can, Miss Nash. Call me Willow," she said, suddenly tired of the formality. "If we're going to be working together, we might as well skip the Miss and Mr. business." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, pleasure perhaps, or satisfaction. "Willow, then. And I'm Marcus, though most folks call me Mark." Patterson left them to discuss the details of the work ahead, and Willow found herself walking with Marcus toward the cabin where she would be staying. He carried her saddlebag without asking, a courtesy that felt natural rather than performative. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow on the dusty ground, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid melody. "You really meant it?" Willow asked as they walked. "About wanting to learn." Marcus glanced at her, his expression serious. "I don't say things I don't mean. I've spent my whole life working ranches from Montana down to here in Texas, and I've seen plenty of horse breakers who rely on force and fear. It works after a fashion, but it breaks something in the horses too. What you did this morning, the way that stallion came to you of his own will, that's something entirely different. That's worth learning if you're willing to teach it." They reached the cabin, and Marcus set her saddlebag down on the porch. Willow studied him for a long moment, trying to understand what lay behind his words. Trust did not come easily to her. She had been disappointed too many times by men who claimed to respect her work, but ultimately wanted only to exploit her talent without honoring the philosophy behind it. "I'll teach you," she said finally, "but you have to understand that it's not a quick process. It requires you to change the way you think about horses, about power, about control. Some men can't make that shift. Their pride gets in the way." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "I'm not interested in pride. I'm interested in doing right by the horses. That's all that matters to me." Something in the quiet conviction of his words convinced Willow that he meant them. She nodded slowly. "All right then. We'll start tomorrow morning early before it gets too hot. Meet me at the stallion's corral at dawn." Marcus smiled again, that same transformation of his features that Willow found unexpectedly appealing. "I'll be there," he promised, and then he touched his hat brim and walked away toward the bunkhouse where the ranch hands stayed, leaving Willow standing on the cabin porch with the feeling that something significant had just begun, though she could not quite name what it was. That night, Willow lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. Cattle lowed in the distance, and closer by, horses moved restlessly in their corrals. She thought about Marcus Whitmore and the way he had looked at her, not with the hungry appraisal she was accustomed to from men, but with something that felt like recognition. It had been a long time since Willow had allowed herself to think about companionship, about the possibility of sharing her life with someone who might understand the work that consumed her. Most men were threatened by her independence, her unconventional skills, her refusal to conform to the expectations society had for women. But Marcus seemed different, or perhaps she was simply fooling herself, seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was truly there. Time would tell, she supposed. Time and proximity and the work they would do together with the wild Mustang that had looked at her with those knowing eyes. Dawn came cold and clear, with mist rising from the creek that ran through Patterson's property. Willow dressed quickly, braided her hair, and made her way to the stallion's corral. Marcus was already there, sitting on the fence rail with 2 tin cups in his hands. He offered her one as she approached, and she was surprised to find it contained hot coffee, strong and black. "Thought you might need this," he said simply. Willow accepted the cup gratefully and drank, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "You're up early." "Habit," Marcus replied. "I've always been awake before the sun. Feels like the best part of the day before everything gets complicated." Willow understood exactly what he meant. She felt the same way about these quiet morning hours when the world seemed fresh and full of possibility. They stood together in companionable silence, drinking their coffee and watching the stallion, who stood at the far end of the corral regarding them with cautious interest. "First lesson," Willow said when she had finished her coffee, "is about observation. Before you ever approach a horse, you need to understand its body language. The position of its ears, the tension in its muscles, the way it holds its weight. Every horse is communicating all the time. Most people just don't know how to listen." For the next hour, Willow walked Marcus through the subtle signs that indicated a horse's emotional state. She pointed out how the stallion's ears swiveled to track their movements, how his nostrils flared when he caught their scent, how he shifted his weight onto his hindquarters when he felt uncertain, preparing to flee if necessary. Marcus listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed he was genuinely trying to understand rather than simply going through the motions to impress her. When Willow finally entered the corral, Marcus remained outside, watching as she repeated the process from the previous day. She began with humming, that low vibration that seemed to reach something primal in the horse's brain. then gradually added whispered words, building the bridge of communication between them. The stallion approached more quickly today, remembering her from before, and within 20 minutes she was able to stroke his neck and shoulder while he stood calmly beside her. "Now you try," Willow called to Marcus. "Come in slowly, and remember everything you observed about his body language. The moment you see his ears pin back or his muscles tense, stop moving." Marcus climbed over the fence and approached with admirable patience. Willow continued stroking the stallion, keeping him calm, while Marcus came to stand beside her. The horse's ears flicked back toward Marcus, monitoring this new presence, but he did not shy away. Willow took Marcus's hand, guiding it to the stallion's shoulder, showing him the kind of firm but gentle pressure that communicated confidence without aggression. "Talk to him," she instructed softly. "Doesn't matter what you say, really. It's the tone that matters. Low and calm and steady." Marcus began to speak, and Willow was struck by how naturally he seemed to understand the assignment. He did not use baby talk or rough commands, but instead spoke to the stallion as if he were a respected colleague, commenting on the morning weather, the quality of the hay, the strong lines of the horse's build. His voice had a musical quality when he spoke this way, a rhythmic cadence that seemed to soothe the stallion as effectively as Willow's humming had. They worked together like that for another hour, gradually building the horse's comfort with human touch, until the sun had climbed high enough to make the work uncomfortable in the growing heat. Willow called an end to the session, and they left the stallion to rest and process what he had learned. "You're a natural," Willow told Marcus as they walked back toward the main ranch buildings. "Most people either try too hard or don't try enough. You found the right balance." Marcus looked pleased by the praise, but there was something else in his expression too, a kind of intensity that made Willow's pulse quicken. "I had a good teacher," he said. "And watching you work, it's like watching someone speak a language I've always wanted to learn but never knew existed." They fell into a pattern over the following days. Early mornings working with the stallion, building his trust and beginning the slow process of introducing him to halter and lead rope. Long afternoons when the heat made work impossible, spent in the shade of the cottonwoods where Willow taught Marcus about her grandmother's philosophy, the old ways of understanding horses as partners rather than property. Evenings when the ranch came alive with activity, meals taken in the main house where Patterson's housekeeper served hearty food, and the ranch hands told stories about their days. Willow found herself looking forward to the time she spent with Marcus with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. They talked about everything, their conversations ranging from practical matters about horse training to deeper subjects like what they wanted from their lives, what dreams they carried, what losses they had survived. Marcus told her about growing up on a small ranch in Montana, about losing his father to a winter fever when he was 16 and having to take over the operation before he was ready, about eventually selling the place when debts became too crushing and taking to the road, hiring himself out to ranches across the West. Willow shared her own story about her mother's death and her father's subsequent descent into drink that had made staying in their hometown of Fort Worth impossible, about her grandmother's teachings and how she had turned them into a way to support herself, traveling from ranch to ranch, gentling horses that other people had given up on, about the loneliness of that life, always moving, never putting down roots, never allowing herself to get close to anyone because she knew she would eventually have to leave. "Doesn't have to be that way," Marcus said one evening as they sat on the corral fence watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple. The stallion had progressed beautifully over the past week, now allowing both Willow and Marcus to handle him without resistance, and there was a satisfaction in that shared accomplishment that felt precious to Willow. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she thought she knew. Marcus turned to look at her, and in the fading light his eyes seemed darker, more serious. "This wandering life, it doesn't have to be permanent. A person could find a place to settle if they wanted to, find a reason to stay." Willow's heart beat faster, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "I've never been one for settling. I get restless." "Maybe you just haven't found the right place yet," Marcus suggested, "or the right reason." The air between them felt charged with something unspoken, and Willow found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by a pull she could not quite resist. Marcus reached out and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his touch gentle but deliberate, and Willow felt that touch all the way through her body like an electric current. "Marcus," she began, not sure what she meant to say, but before she could continue, Jake Morrison called out from the direction of the barn, needing Marcus's help with a mare that was having trouble foaling. The moment broke, and Marcus hopped down from the fence with obvious reluctance. "We'll finish this conversation," he said, and it sounded like a promise. Willow watched him walk away, her skin still tingling where he had touched her face, and wondered what she was doing. She had always been so careful to guard her heart, to keep her relationships professional and temporary. But Marcus was slipping past her defenses with an ease that should have terrified her. And instead, she found herself hoping, dangerous as hope was, that maybe this time could be different. The following day, Patterson asked Willow and Marcus to take the stallion out on a trail ride, testing how he would handle open terrain now that he had accepted saddle and rider. It was a significant milestone, and Willow felt a mixture of pride and nervousness as she swung up onto the stallion's back for the first time. The horse tensed briefly, feeling her weight, but then relaxed as she began her familiar humming and whispered reassurances. Marcus rode beside her on his paint gelding, and they set out across Patterson's land toward the hills beyond. It was a perfect spring morning, with wildflowers blooming across the prairie and birds singing in every tree. The stallion moved with powerful grace beneath Willow, and she could feel the joy in him, the pleasure of running free again, but now with a companion who understood him. They rode for hours, following deer trails up into the hills where the air was cooler, and the views stretched endlessly in all directions. At midday, they stopped beside a clear stream to let the horses drink and rest, and Willow found herself standing very close to Marcus as they shared the lunch Patterson's housekeeper had packed for them. "I meant what I said yesterday," Marcus told her, his voice quiet but firm. "About finding reasons to stay. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually, about what it would take for me to stop wandering and put down roots somewhere." Willow's mouth felt dry despite the water she had just drunk. "And what conclusion did you come to?" Marcus set down the biscuit he had been holding and turned to face her fully. "That the place doesn't matter as much as the people. I could settle anywhere if I had the right person beside me. Someone who understood this life, who loved horses the way I do, who wasn't afraid of hard work or long days." He paused, then added, "Someone like you, Willow." The words hung in the air between them, clear and unmistakable in their meaning. Willow's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke or change the subject, anything to avoid the vulnerability of this moment. But when she looked into Marcus's eyes, she saw such honest hope there that she could not bring herself to dismiss his feelings or her own. "I've never let myself think about settling down," she admitted. "It seemed impossible, given the way I live, and I've never met anyone who made me want to reconsider that decision. Until now." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that Willow could feel the heat radiating from his body in the cool mountain air. "I'm not asking you to give up your work," he said. "God knows I respect what you do too much to ever ask that, but maybe we could figure out a way to do it together. Build something that's ours. A place where we could train horses the way you've been teaching me, gentle them instead of breaking them. There's got to be a market for that, people who would pay good money for horses trained with your methods." The vision he painted was so seductive that Willow felt her resistance crumbling. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of her grandmother's legacy and her own survival on her shoulders without anyone to share the burden. The possibility of partnership, of building something meaningful with someone who understood her, was almost too appealing to bear. "I'm scared," she confessed, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I've lost everyone I ever cared about. My grandmother, my mother, even my father in a way, though he's still alive somewhere. I don't know if I can go through that kind of loss again." Marcus reached up and cupped her face in both his hands, his calloused palms rough but tender against her skin. "I can't promise you'll never lose me," he said honestly. "Life's too uncertain for that, but I can promise that for as long as I'm here, I'll stand beside you. I'll honor your gifts and support your work and love you with everything I have. That's all any of us can offer, really." The willingness to try. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home to a place Willow had never been but had always been searching for. His lips were warm and sure against hers, and she kissed him back with an intensity that surprised them both. The horses grazed peacefully nearby, and the stream burbled over its rocks, and for a few perfect minutes, Willow allowed herself to simply feel without thinking, to accept the gift Marcus was offering without questioning whether she deserved it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "So is that a yes? You'll at least think about the possibility?" Willow found herself smiling back, a real smile that came from somewhere deep in her chest. "Yes," she said. "I'll think about it. More than think about it, actually. I want to try, Marcus. I want to see if we can build something together." The ride back to Patterson's ranch seemed to take no time at all, both of them caught up in planning and dreaming, talking over each other in their excitement about what their future might look like. They would need to save money first, enough to buy some land and build a barn and corrals. They would need to establish a reputation, get word out about their training methods, find clients who valued quality over speed. It would not be easy, but working together, sharing the load, it felt possible in a way that nothing had felt possible to Willow for years. Over the following week, as Willow completed her work with the stallion and prepared to move on to her next job, she and Marcus talked late into every evening, refining their plans, getting to know each other in all the small ways that mattered. She learned that he took his coffee with honey when he could get it, that he had a beautiful singing voice he was shy about using, that he read whenever he could find books and had a particular fondness for poetry. He learned that she was afraid of spiders but not snakes, that she could cook better than she let on but preferred not to when she could avoid it, that she had once wanted to be a teacher but had found her true calling with horses instead. On Willow's last night at Patterson's ranch, Marcus asked her to take a walk with him under the stars. They wandered away from the lights of the ranch buildings until they stood alone in the prairie darkness, surrounded by the sounds of night creatures and the vast sweep of the Milky Way overhead. Marcus took both her hands in his and looked at her with such tenderness that Willow felt her eyes sting with tears. "I know we're moving fast," he said, "and I know you need to finish your current commitments before we can start building our own operation. But I need you to know that I'm serious about this, about us. I'm in love with you, Willow Nash, and I'll wait as long as it takes for us to be ready to start our life together." Willow had never been good at declarations of emotion, had always felt clumsy and inarticulate when it came to expressing what was in her heart. But standing there in the darkness with Marcus's hands warm around hers, the words came more easily than she expected. "I love you too," she said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her entire body. "I didn't think I could, didn't think I had it in me after everything I've lost. But you've shown me something different, something I didn't know was possible. You've shown me that partnership doesn't mean losing myself, that I can share my life without giving up who I am." When Marcus kissed her this time, it was slower, deeper, a kiss that spoke of commitment and promise and all the years they would have together. Willow wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the hope and love she had been holding back for so long. And under the vast Texas sky, surrounded by the wild land they both loved, they sealed their future with that embrace. The next morning, Willow left Patterson's ranch with Marcus riding beside her, heading toward the next job that waited for her in a town 40 miles to the south. They had agreed that Marcus would accompany her as she fulfilled her existing contracts, learning more about her methods and saving his wages alongside hers so they could purchase land by the end of the year. Patterson had been disappointed to lose a good ranch hand, but had understood when Marcus explained his plans, had even promised to send clients their way once they established their operation. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Willow's life. She and Marcus traveled together from ranch to ranch, gentling horses that others had deemed too wild or too damaged to train. Word of their methods spread quickly, and soon they had more work than they could handle, ranchers willing to pay premium prices for horses trained with patience and respect rather than broken with force. They saved every penny they could spare, sleeping under the stars more often than not to avoid paying for lodging, eating simple meals, denying themselves any luxuries beyond what was absolutely necessary. By September, they had enough saved to begin seriously looking for land. They wanted something not too far from Abilene, close enough to the cattle trails that there would be steady demand for well-trained horses, but remote enough that they could have the space and quiet necessary for their work. They searched for 3 weeks before finding exactly what they needed: 100 acres of good grassland with a creek running through it, and a cluster of oak trees that would provide shade for the horses. The property came with a small house that needed work and a barn that needed even more, but the price was within their budget, and the land itself was perfect. They made an offer that same day, and a week later they signed the papers that made them landowners, partners in both business and life. They were married in early October by a circuit preacher passing through Abilene, with Patterson and a few of the ranch hands standing as witnesses. Willow wore a simple blue dress that Marcus said made her eyes look like the sky at twilight, and Marcus wore a new shirt and vest that Willow had insisted on buying him despite his protests about the expense. The ceremony was brief and unsentimental, but when Marcus slipped a gold band onto Willow's finger and promised to love and honor her for all their days, Willow felt tears slip down her cheeks for the first time in years. Their wedding night was spent in their own house for the first time, on a new mattress that had been Patterson's wedding gift to them, and Willow discovered that physical intimacy with someone she loved and trusted was an entirely different experience from what she had imagined it might be. Marcus was patient and attentive, learning her body the same way he had learned to gentle horses, with care and respect and genuine interest in her responses. They made love slowly while the autumn wind rattled the windows and the moon rose over their land, and afterward, Willow lay in Marcus's arms feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. The first year of their marriage was filled with hard work and small triumphs. They repaired the house and barn, built corrals and fencing, acquired their first horses to train. Clients began arriving in a steady stream, and Willow and Marcus developed a reputation for being able to gentle even the most difficult animals. They worked from dawn until dusk most days, but they worked side by side, and that made all the difference. Willow taught Marcus everything her grandmother had taught her, all the old songs and whispers and ways of reading a horse's spirit. Marcus proved to be an excellent student, and soon could work almost as effectively as Willow herself, though he always maintained that she had a special gift that could not be fully learned. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths, covering each other's weaknesses, building something that was greater than the sum of its parts. In the spring of their second year together, Willow discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She had always wanted children, but had also feared the vulnerability that came with loving someone so completely. The terrible possibility of loss that parenthood represented. Marcus was nothing but thrilled, though he became almost comically protective, insisting that Willow reduce her workload and avoid any horses that seemed particularly unpredictable. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," Willow protested when Marcus tried to prevent her from entering a corral with a particularly skittish mare. "I've been doing this work my whole life. A baby isn't going to change that." But she did make some concessions to her condition, allowing Marcus to take on more of the physical work, while she focused on the initial assessment and gentling that required more patience than strength. As her belly grew and the baby's movements became stronger, Willow found herself singing to the child the same songs her grandmother had taught her, the same melodies she used with the horses. She wondered if her child would inherit this gift, this ability to communicate with animals in ways that seemed almost magical. Their son was born on a hot August night with a midwife from Abilene attending, and Marcus hovering anxiously nearby. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Willow feared that something would go wrong, that she would pay for her happiness with the loss of this child or her own life. But as dawn broke over the prairie, she delivered a healthy baby boy with a powerful set of lungs and Marcus's creek water eyes. They named him Matthew, and he transformed their lives in ways both expected and surprising. Willow had thought she might resent the way motherhood constrained her work, but instead, she found herself enchanted by this tiny person who depended on her so completely. Marcus proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Matthew when he cried at night, singing lullabies in that beautiful voice he had been too shy to use before, making toys from scraps of wood and leather. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, it became clear that he had indeed inherited Willow's gift. Animals of all kinds were drawn to him, from the barn cats who curled up beside his cradle to the horses who nickered softly when he toddled into the barn holding Marcus's hand. By the time he was 3 years old, Matthew could calm a nervous horse with nothing more than his presence, and Willow saw her grandmother's legacy continuing into a new generation. Their daughter was born 2 years after Matthew, arriving with much less drama on a mild spring morning. They named her Rose, and she had Willow's dark hair and determined temperament. Where Matthew was patient and intuitive with the horses, Rose was bold and fearless, climbing corral fences before she could properly walk and demanding to be lifted onto the horses' backs at every opportunity. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family, seasons turning from spring to summer to fall to winter and back again. Willow and Marcus's operation grew and prospered, their reputation spreading far beyond Abilene until they were training horses for ranchers as far away as Kansas and New Mexico. They hired help as the work increased, teaching their methods to others, spreading the philosophy that Willow's grandmother had passed down about treating horses as partners rather than property. There were difficult times too, of course. A terrible drought one summer that killed half their grass and forced them to buy expensive feed. A winter so harsh that they lost two of their best mares to the cold, despite everything they tried. An accident that left Marcus with a broken leg and unable to work for 3 months, forcing Willow to carry the entire operation while also caring for 2 young children. But they weathered each challenge together, their partnership growing stronger rather than weaker with each test. Matthew turned out to have not just his mother's gift with horses, but also a talent for training that surpassed even Willow and Marcus. By the time he was 15, he was handling some of the most difficult cases on his own, gentling horses that his parents would have once thought beyond redemption. He had inherited Marcus's patience and Willow's intuition, and watching him work filled both his parents with immense pride. Rose took a different path, showing more interest in the business side of the operation than the training itself. She had a head for numbers and negotiation that neither Willow nor Marcus possessed, and by her teenage years, she was handling most of their client relationships and finances, freeing her parents to focus on the horses themselves. One evening when Matthew was 17 and Rose was 15, Willow stood with Marcus on the porch of their house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were in the barn finishing the evening feeding, and from this distance, Willow could hear Matthew singing to the horses, his voice carrying clear and sweet through the twilight air. "You ever regret it?" Marcus asked, his arm warm around Willow's shoulders. "Giving up the wandering life, settling down here." Willow leaned into her husband's embrace, breathing in the familiar scent of him, horse and leather and sun-warmed skin. "Not for a single moment," she said honestly. "This life we've built, our children, this place where we can do the work we love and be together, it's more than I ever dreamed was possible." Marcus kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Willow felt tears prick her eyes the way they still did sometimes, when she was overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of her happiness. "I love you," he said simply. "Just as much now as I did that first day when I watched you gentle that wild Mustang and knew I'd never seen anything like you." Those words, spoken with the same wonder that had colored his voice all those years ago, still had the power to move Willow deeply. She turned in his arms and kissed him properly, a kiss that held all the love and gratitude and partnership they had built over nearly 2 decades together. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "You took a chance on a wandering horse whisperer and gave me a home, a family, a life I didn't know how to want until you showed me it was possible." As the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Willow and Marcus stood together on their porch, surrounded by everything they had created through hard work and love and unwavering faith in each other. In the barn, their children's voices mingled with the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. Beyond the barn, their land stretched away in every direction, 100 acres of prairie and possibility that would someday pass to Matthew and Rose and whatever children they might have. The wild Mustang that had brought Willow and Marcus together all those years ago had long since passed on, living out a peaceful life in their pastures and siring dozens of foals that carried his spirit and gentleness. But his legacy lived on in every horse they trained, in the methods they had refined and taught to others, in the philosophy that respect and patience were always more powerful than force and fear. As Willow drifted to sleep that night in the arms of the man who had seen something special in her from the very beginning, she thought about all the paths her life might have taken, all the different choices she might have made. She could have kept wandering, never allowing herself to trust or love or settle. She could have dismissed Marcus's interest, protected herself behind walls that nothing could penetrate. She could have chosen safety and solitude over the risk and vulnerability of partnership. But she had chosen differently, had found the courage to accept the gift Marcus offered, and that single choice had led to everything else. To this home, this family, this life filled with purpose and connection and love. Years continued to pass, each one adding its own layers to the story. Willow and Marcus had begun that morning beside a canyon when a wild stallion had trusted a whispering woman, and a wondering man had recognized something extraordinary. Matthew married a woman he met at a horse auction in Dallas, a school teacher named Sarah who loved his gentleness and shared his passion for animals. They settled on land adjacent to Willow and Marcus's property, building their own operation that specialized in training horses for children and families who wanted safe, reliable mounts. Rose married a lawyer from Abilene who appreciated her sharp mind and business acumen. They lived in town, but Rose remained deeply involved in the family business, eventually expanding it to include a breeding program that produced some of the finest horses in Texas. Her husband, David, proved surprisingly good with the horses himself, despite his city upbringing, and he and Marcus became close friends who spent long evenings discussing everything from politics to philosophy. Willow and Marcus became grandparents multiple times over, watching with joy as Matthew and Sarah's 4 children and Rose and David's 3 filled the ranch with noise and energy, and the kind of chaos that comes with young ones. The grandchildren all showed varying degrees of the gift that had started with Willow's grandmother, some possessing it strongly, others displaying only traces, but all of them growing up with a respect for horses and an understanding that animals were to be treated as companions rather than tools. As Willow entered her 50s, she began to slow down somewhat, no longer able to put in the 16-hour days that had characterized her youth. But she found that she enjoyed this new phase of life, taking time to teach her grandchildren the old songs and stories, working with only the most interesting or challenging horses, spending long afternoons with Marcus doing nothing more strenuous than sitting on the porch and watching the land they loved. Marcus's hair had gone completely gray, and his face had weathered into deep lines. But to Willow he was still the young man who had told her he'd never seen anything like her, whose eyes still lit up when she entered a room. They had been married for over 30 years, and their love had deepened and matured like good wine, becoming something rich and complex and infinitely precious. One summer evening when Willow was 54 and Marcus was 57, they took a ride together, just the two of them, something they had not done in far too long. Their grown children could handle the ranch for one afternoon, and Willow wanted to visit the place where she had first gentled the wild Mustang all those decades ago, wanted to stand with Marcus in the spot where their story had truly begun. They rode slowly, in no particular hurry, talking about everything and nothing. Marcus pointed out a hawk riding the thermals overhead, and Willow showed him where wildflowers had begun to bloom in a particularly rocky stretch of prairie. It was comfortable and easy, this companionship they had built, and Willow felt grateful for every single day of it. When they reached the canyon, they dismounted and stood at the edge, looking down into the depths where shadows pooled. Willow could almost see her younger self standing here, humming to a terrified stallion while a group of skeptical men watched from hiding. She could almost feel the weight of uncertainty she had carried then, the loneliness that had seemed like a permanent condition of her life. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, coming to stand beside her. About how much has changed, Willow said. About how none of this would exist if that stallion hadn't trusted me, if you hadn't seen something worth learning in what I did, if I hadn't been brave enough to take a chance on you. Marcus took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. I'm glad you were brave, he said. I'm glad we both were. Building this life with you has been the greatest adventure I could have imagined. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, while their horses grazed nearby and the sun tracked slowly across the sky. Eventually, they would need to head back, to return to the ranch and the life that waited for them there. But for now, in this moment, they simply stood together in the place where everything had begun. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from that first connection. As they rode home in the long golden light of late afternoon, Willow thought about the wild Mustang and how gentling him had been about earning trust rather than breaking will, about offering partnership rather than demanding submission. She thought about how the same principle had guided her marriage, how she and Marcus had built their life together through mutual respect and shared purpose and the willingness to be vulnerable with each other. That night, lying in bed with Marcus's steady breathing beside her and moonlight streaming through their window, Willow felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had been given so many gifts in her life, her grandmother's teachings, her own intuitive understanding of horses, the courage to build a business around her skills. But the greatest gift had been Marcus himself, this man who had seen her true self from the very beginning and loved her not despite her unconventional nature, but because of it. The years that followed brought their own share of joys and sorrows. Marcus's mother passed away at 87, and Willow stood beside her husband at the funeral, holding his hand while he said goodbye to the woman who had raised him. One of Matthew's children, a boy named Thomas, showed such an extraordinary gift with horses that even Willow was amazed, and she spent countless hours teaching him everything she knew, passing down the legacy that had started with her grandmother 3 generations earlier. Rose's business expansion turned their operation into one of the most respected horse breeding and training facilities in the entire state of Texas. They received inquiries from as far away as California, and even a few from back east, people who had heard stories about the Whisper Woman who could gentle any horse, and the family she had built around that remarkable gift. Willow published a book when she was 60, a slim volume that combined her grandmother's teachings with her own decades of experience. It was not a bestseller, but it found its audience among people who cared deeply about horses and wanted to learn better ways of working with them. The book ensured that even after Willow was gone, her methods would continue to spread and influence how people approached horse training. Marcus remained healthy and active well into his 60s, still able to put in a full day's work when needed, though both he and Willow had officially retired and turned the day-to-day operations over to their children. They spent their days doing exactly what they wanted, working with horses when the mood struck them, spending time with their grandchildren, taking long rides across land that would remain in their family for generations to come. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Matthew and Rose organized a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by Willow and Marcus's work. Former clients traveled from across the West to attend, bringing stories about horses that Willow and Marcus had gentled decades earlier, horses whose descendants were still being ridden and valued. Friends and neighbors filled the ranch, and there was music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. As Willow danced with Marcus under strings of lanterns while a fiddler played and their family and friends celebrated around them, she felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life they had built together. "Thank you," she whispered to Marcus as they swayed together to the music. "For seeing me, for believing in me, for building this with me." Marcus pulled her closer, and she could feel his smile against her hair. "Thank you for being brave enough to let me love you," he said. "Thank you for sharing your gift and your life and giving me a purpose beyond just surviving. You made me better than I ever could have been alone." The party continued late into the night, but eventually the guests departed and the family retired to their own homes, and Willow and Marcus were left alone in the house that had sheltered them for 40 years. They stood on the porch one more time, looking out over their land in the moonlight, and Willow thought about all the horses that had passed through their corrals, all the people they had taught, all the love and work and dreams that had gone into creating this place. "We did good," Marcus said quietly, and Willow knew he was thinking similar thoughts. "We did," she agreed, leaning against him. "Better than good. We built something that will last long after we're gone." The final years of their lives together were gentle ones, marked by the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you have lived well and loved deeply. They spent their days in simple pleasures, sitting together in the morning sunshine, telling stories to their great-grandchildren, watching new foals take their first wobbly steps in the spring pastures. The gift that had started with Willow's grandmother continued strong in the younger generations, ensuring that their philosophy and methods would endure. Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, with Willow beside him as she had been for nearly 50 years. The grief was profound but not bitter, because Willow knew that they had been given something rare and precious, a lifetime of partnership and love that many people never experienced. At his funeral, which was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, Willow stood with their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren around her, surrounded by the family they had created together. And she spoke about the man who had seen something special in a wandering horse whisperer and built a life with her that exceeded every dream. Willow lived for another 8 years after Marcus's death, and while she missed him every single day, she did not spend those years in sorrow. Instead, she threw herself into teaching, working with her great-grandchildren and anyone else who wanted to learn, ensuring that the knowledge her grandmother had passed down would survive into yet another generation. She wrote 2 more books, expanded and refined her methods, and remained active in the horse training community until the very end. On a warm spring morning in her 87th year, Willow Nash Whitmore passed away in her sleep in the house she and Marcus had shared for so long. Her children found her with a peaceful expression on her weathered face, and beside her bed was a photograph of her and Marcus on their wedding day, young and full of hope, ready to begin the adventure that had become their life. At her funeral, which was held on the ranch under an endless Texas sky, her family shared stories about the woman who could gentle wild mustangs with whispers, who had taught them all that strength came not from dominance, but from understanding, not from breaking but from building trust. They talked about the love story she had lived with Marcus, how 2 wandering souls had found each other and created something that would endure for generations. Thomas, the great-grandson who had inherited the strongest version of Willow's gift, spoke last. He was 23 years old and already recognized as one of the finest horse trainers in the state, carrying forward the legacy that his great-grandmother had started. He talked about the lessons she had taught him, about patience and respect, and the importance of listening to what horses were trying to communicate. And he told the story, which had been passed down and refined over the decades, about a day long ago when a wild mustang stood at a canyon's edge, and a woman approached with nothing but whispers and understanding, and a cowboy watched and said he had never seen anything like her. She changed the way people think about horses, Thomas said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. But more than that, she showed us how to live with integrity and purpose, how to build something meaningful through hard work and love. Her legacy is not just in the methods she taught us, but in the life she lived, the family she raised, the love story she and our great-grandfather wrote together across 50 years. As Thomas spoke, a wind came up across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and new grass, and somewhere in the distance, horses whinnied to each other in the pastures where Willow and Marcus's descendants continued the work they had started so long ago. The sun shone down on the land they had loved, on the barn they had built with their own hands, on the house where they had raised their children and grown old together. And if you stood very quietly in just the right spot near the canyon where it all began, some folks swore you could still hear echoes of an old melody, a humming that seemed to drift on the wind, the ghost of a whisper that once gentled wild mustangs and changed the life of a cowboy who had never seen anything like the woman who sang it. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Willow and Marcus's children and grandchildren, each generation adding their own innovations while staying true to the core philosophy that had been the foundation of everything. Young horses still arrived wild and fearful, and they still left gentle and willing, transformed not through force but through patience and understanding, and the kind of communication that Willow had pioneered and passed down through her family. The story of Willow Nash and Marcus Whitmore became something of a legend in Texas horse training circles, told and retold until the details took on an almost mythical quality. But those who had known them, who had worked with them and learned from them and witnessed the quiet devotion they showed each other every single day, knew that the truth was even better than the legend. They had been real people who worked hard and loved deeply, who built something meaningful from nothing, who proved that two people committed to each other and to a shared vision could create ripples that would spread far beyond their own lifetimes. Years after both Willow and Marcus had passed on, visitors still came to the ranch to see where the famous Whisper Woman had lived and worked. The family welcomed these pilgrims and shared stories about Willow and Marcus, keeping their memory alive not as distant historical figures, but as flesh and blood people who had lived extraordinary lives through their commitment to doing ordinary things with extraordinary love and care. In the barn, hanging above the doorway to what had been Willow's favorite training corral, was a wooden sign that Matthew had carved in his mother's honor. It bore a simple inscription that captured everything Willow had believed and taught. Trust is earned in whispers, not shouts. Respect is built through patience, not force. Love makes everything possible. And on quiet mornings when the mist rose from the creek and the horses moved like ghosts through the pastures, those who worked the ranch swore they could sometimes feel the presence of the two people who had started it all. A gentle, encouraging feeling when working with a particularly difficult horse, a sense of rightness when making decisions about the land, a warmth in the heart that felt like blessing and approval from ancestors who had loved this place and each other with everything they had. The wild mustangs still ran in the hills beyond the ranch, descendants perhaps of that first stallion who had trusted a whispering woman so many decades ago. And sometimes, very rarely, one of those wild horses would find their way to the ranch's borders, drawn by something they could not name but somehow recognized. When that happened, whoever noticed would often think of Willow, of how she would have approached the skittish animal, what whispers she would have used, what patient incremental process she would have employed to build trust. And in those moments, the past and present seemed to collapse together, and it was possible to believe that love stories never truly end, that the effects of a life well lived ripple out across time like waves on a pond. touching people and animals and places in ways both seen and unseen, leaving the world gentler and kinder and more beautiful than it was before. This was the legacy of Willow Nash Whitmore and Marcus Whitmore, the Whisper Woman and the Cowboy who had never seen anything like her. Not just a horse training method, or a successful ranch, or even a large and loving family, but a testament to what becomes possible when two people find each other and choose, every single day, to build something together through love and respect and unwavering commitment to each other, and to the work that gives their lives meaning. And so the story ends not with death but with continuation, with the ongoing ripples of lives fully lived and deeply loved, with horses still being gentled through whispers, with families still being built on foundations of trust and respect, with the endless Texas sky still stretching over land that will forever bear the marks of the two people who loved it and each other so well.